welcome to episode 33. Episode 33, season 5 of the Fat Doctor podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Ashalami, aka the Fat Doctor. Today we're going to be talking once again about a very important principle that we all need to be aware of, a very important fact, a very important, for me, it's like a foundational principle for weight inclusive care, which is that losing weight won't prevent health problems. I know that, and hopefully you know that. If you don't know that yet, it's all right. Welcome. Maybe you're new here. But yeah, losing weight won't prevent health problems. I have created 17 already, and I'm continually updating this. 17 masterclasses, 17 different conditions that are supposedly linked to being fat, quote unquote, obesity related conditions, where I demonstrate in no uncertain terms that being fat doesn't cause them. Sorry, not sorry. But there's more, there's always more. But today I'm not gonna get down to as much as I love to explain the science. That's not what I'm here to do today. This is going to be more of a history lesson than anything else. I want to challenge this belief by asking you, why do you believe it in the first place? And I got it. I get it. You've been told your whole life, you've been told that being fat is bad for your health. I mean, anything other than that is ridiculous. But we didn't always believe this. We didn't always believe this, and when we find out how we came to believe this, it's interesting, folks. It's very, very interesting. Um, so for a very long time, and I'm not going to get into this history because this is not my history to share. There are brilliant people out there who have done a much better job talking about how fat phobia, fear of the fat body, has existed for several centuries. And there's a very good book called Fearing the Black Body by Dr. Sabrina Strings, and I recommend that you read it. If you haven't, it's a weighty book, but it's full of really important facts that will help shape your understanding of how society came to hate fat people. Because we didn't always. Once upon a time, fat was revered. Being fat was a sign that you were wealthy, and so being fat was, considered a good thing, if anything. If anything. It was either neutral or good for thousands of years. And then things changed, and I won't go into the history of that. I will mention one chap. His name is Adolf Quetelet. He is known to some. Is I'm not going to say famous. It's like a G-list celebrity, but he is a celebrity within this little corner of the internet, within the sort of weight inclusive, health at every size, anti-diet world. Everyone's heard of Quetelet. He was a man of he had many side hustles going on, multiple revenues of income, multiple jobs, very millennial, post-millennial, like he was a statistician and a astronomer and just all sorts of things. He was very much inspired by what the early 19th century error theorists. So error theory was basically they discovered what we now know is the bell-shaped curve. They discovered that when you look at a population, whatever you're looking at, say height, the majority of the population is centered around this, is in the middle of this bell-shaped curve. Most people kind of on either side of average. And then there are a few scragglers, and there's fewer and fewer as you go out. So it forms this little bell shape, what we call normal distribution. And this is the case for most things. So he, this was a new concept. So at one point in time, this was a new concept. And Quetelet observed that certain human features like height and weight were also normally distributed, just like everything else. And he studied a handful of Western European, I believe predominantly male soldiers. But that was how he came to his conclusions. And I don't think he's right. Height and weight absolutely do follow the normal distribution curves. And that's the case for everybody. What was interesting about Quetelet, though, is that he had decided in his infinite wisdom that average, mean, median, middle of the bell was ideal. That was different. he published work called L'Homme Moyen, which just basically means the average man. Sorry if I mispronounced that, if I butchered the pronunciation. So what he was doing was he took a statistical artifact, the fact that, there was an average, and he turned it into a moral value. He linked the average man to beauty, to health, to moral goodness, to all of these things. And he therefore said that those who deviated from the mean, especially those in the kind of like at the sort of ends of the bell shape, they were linked to vice, immorality, illness, ugliness, all of that jazz. So that's a bit problematic, isn't it? Who says normal is good? Who says average is what we should all aspire to be? I'm not quite sure that's right. I like being. It's interesting, isn't it? In some cases, we want to be above average intelligence, above average athletic ability, above average beauty, if one could define beauty. So it's weird, isn't it? That on the one hand, we want to be above average, but in this case, we're being told that average is where we want to be. Um, Now, a lot of people think that Quetelet is responsible for the BMI. He is not. He just discovered that height and weight, and that was it. Then, much later, so Quetelet was sort of mid 19th century. Louis Ezerel Dublin, turn of the 20th century. He was a public health pioneer. He was employed by the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company from his entire career. So he is he is attributed with being one of the founders of modern day public health. So much so that his obituary was published in the American Journal of Public Health. And as I said, he worked the entire time for an insurance company, and actually his obituary says a mutually supporting partnership. Mutually supporting partnership. Do you get that? So the insurance company and public health were mutually supporting each other. And by that, what I mean is that he and his colleagues literally developed what they call the formulation, a calculation of the monetary value of a man, the monetary value based on how long he was going to live. And they provided dimensions for the length of life and their outlook, how long they were going to live, based on measurements that they calculated to decide how much a man was worth. So we went from being like average and desirable to now this is like literal value, like a tangible value. We put a price on it, quite literally, and we put a price on it so that an insurance company could get rich. And Dublin and his team created the MetLife height and weight tables, and we've used the height and weight tables for decades. And these were created for profit, not for health, but they existed, and he should be credited with it. And even though his health recommendations clearly served corporate interest, his work also became medical gospel. I mean, it's canon, right? Like it is the foundation of a lot of, or his work is the foundation for a lot of work that came after him, basically trying to prove his theory. After Dublin, in the mid 20th century now, there was a chap named Ansel Keys. Again, he's also a bit of a celebrity in this corner of the internet. You might know him because he was the lead investigator of the Minnesota starvation experiment. If you don't know what that is, I suggest you look it up. It's quite interesting. Lesser known fact about Ansel Keys, he launched the 7-country studies in 1958, which explored the relationship between diet, cholesterol, and cardiovascular disease. Again, a lot of the information that we have is based on these studies. He really did not like fat people. He really didn't. Not a fan. He published a paper in 1972 that basically introduced the concept of the body mass index, which he said in his paper, if not fully satisfactory, at least as good as any other relative weight index as an indicator of quote unquote relative obesity. Even he said it wasn't that great. So he launched the 7-country study, and he was also a huge fan of the Mediterranean diet. He was like a pioneer of the Mediterranean diet. When you hear people banging on about the Mediterranean diet and that kind of, I don't know, I've been to Italy many times. I find it really interesting to hear how people describe the Mediterranean diet, especially because, Italian, the Mediterranean diet is very few carbs, which is hilarious because I feel like Italians they didn't invent carbs, but they really do know how to use carbs well, right? Can we agree? Pasta, pizza, bread, like all of that stuff, risotto. They really know how to use carbohydrates. But anyway, I won't go into it in too much detail. Suffice to say, I'm not a fan of this concept of the Mediterranean diet. I love Mediterranean food, just don't agree with the best-selling cookbook published in 1975, How to Eat Well and Stay Well, the Mediterranean Way. My man was like obsessed. Mm. Now, a lot of people talk about body mass index, and I kind of get irritated because I'm like, you haven't quite understood where that comes from. This study published in 1972 took 7,400, again, men from different countries to find the best way to measure if someone, and they, as they described it, was at a healthy weight relative to their height. We had become obsessed with healthy weight relative to height since, well, certainly since Lewis Dublin and the MetLife height and weight tables, possibly even before, even going back, tracing it back to Quetelet and his obsession with the average man. But you see, now the purpose of this study was to figure out the best way to measure if someone is a healthy weight relative to their height. And the issue I have with this is who says there's such a thing as a healthy weight relative to weight to height? Like, when did we decide that there was such a thing in the first place? We didn't always believe that, and then we did believe that. And I'm curious to know what changed. The public opinion changed because that was the purpose of this paper. And so what he did was he tested a whole bunch of mathematical formulas. So he was looking at just average weight. So he was like, maybe average weight is the best way to tell. He looked at weight divided by height. He looked at weight divided by height squared. He looked at something called the ponderal index, which I won't get into because it's really complex. But basically, they were looking at all these different ways to measure whether a person is quote unquote a healthy weight for their relative to their height. And they found that the BMI was the best choice out of the different ones that they chose, by the way, because it was reasonably good at all of the criteria they set out, and it was simple to calculate. So it was just like, oh, this is easy. We can use this. We can apply this very simply. So that was the purpose of this study, to figure out how to measure if someone's a healthy weight relative to their height. But nobody actually explained why they were doing it in the first place. I mean, they gave an explanation, but it wasn't an actual explanation. And at the time of the study in 1972, Ansel Keys and the team, the paper clearly said that BMI was appropriate for population-based studies only. It was not meant for individual evaluation because there was no evidence supporting its use. That was 1972. Then he published his cookbook in 1975. And then he goes off and does his thing, and then we never have to hear from him again. So the MetLife standard tables, the ones I was talking about from MetLife, in 1942, they were the ideal weight. And then in 1959, they changed them or they republished them for the desirable weight. You see, we were ideal, desirable, and then finally just height to weight tables in 1983. But in 1985, the second edition of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans translated the quote unquote desirable weight to height tables from MetLife into BMI. And they decided, like, yeah, I know we're not supposed to use this for anything other than population-based data, but we're going to do it anyway. So we went from ideal weight, desirable weight. BMI is the best way to calculate out of all of the formulas out there, is the best way to calculate that. And then, but only in population studies, to no, now we're just going to just tell you what is and what isn't. This is correct, this is wrong. That was in 85. Now, I'm saying this because I was born in 80s. So this is happening in my lifetime. 10 years later, the WHO got together an expert panel, and they published a very comprehensive report where they tried to define, again, healthy weight for height, and to define what was quote unquote overweight. They did not use the other O word, obesity. It was not in the 1995 WHO report. They did, however, create these lovely little cutoff points of 25, 30, and 40 for BMI. Completely arbitrary cutoffs. No real basis in any evidence whatsoever, just arbitrary. And actually, in that 1995 report, it says there is no agreement about cutoff points for the percentage of body fat that constitutes obesity. There are no clearly established cutoff points for fat mass or fat percentage that can be translated into cutoffs for BMI. Very explicit in 1995. And now pay attention, because this is where it gets, I think, really interesting. The same year as the WHO group of experts said, well, actually, we can't find a cutoff, the International Obesity Task Force was formed. What's that? You might ask. You've probably never heard of it. It was led by, okay, I'm going to just be really honest with you. It started here in Scotland. As a Scottish person, I am ashamed. I'm ashamed to admit it. I'm very proud to be Scottish. The Scots have produced a lot of amazing things. In society today, there were so many things that Scotland has produced, and you should be grateful. But this is not one of them. The International Obesity Task Force was led by Philip James, who is the director of what is now known as the Rowett Research Institute. It was a self-appointed task force. Just decided to appoint themselves as a task force. So it wasn't set up by the WHO or by any organisation that existed at the time, just its own one. Set up as a charity, as they always are. Funded, and can you guess who funded it? Want to hazard a guess? It was funded almost entirely by contributions from the pharmaceutical industry. In 2013, Philip James told a reporter, they used to give me checks for about £200,000. Looks like, I don't know, is it $250,000 at a time? But this was in 95, so it's a lot more now, right? At a time. I think I had 1 million or more. Rich man. I don't know if he had 1 million or more checks for 200,000. I don't think so. I think that's too much. He had a lot of money. What I'm saying is he got a lot of money. He was just getting money. Just got very rich. And I have a quote here. At its inception, the International Obesity Task Force had its explicit purpose. So why did they exist? The purpose was to convince the WHO to hold a special consultation solely devoted to obesity. So as you know, there was an expert panel in 1995 at the same time that these guys were born. However, they wanted to push this agenda. That was their job, to push the agenda. And when I say they, I mean the pharmaceutical industry that set up this self-appointed task force that set up as a charity. And the money that was raised by this charity provided a very large grant to the World Health Organization to fund this consultation that they absolutely insisted needs to happen. So this consultation happened in 1997. And then it turned out that there was going to be this huge backlog there was a huge backlog in the WHO, and it's going to take years to publish all the findings of this. And the IOTF were not having that. They just were like, no, Philip James and his lot, nope, that's not acceptable. So they decided that it was going to take too long, so they would just publish it. They just published the original version and send it immediately to everybody, to anybody and everyone that they could. And they did. To all sorts of politicians, organizations, whatever. They just published it without waiting for the WHO to do it. Now, at the same time, this is all happening in the World Health Organization, it's happening in Europe, it's happening in Scotland. At the same time, in the United States of America, another expert panel was convened at the same time as the WHO, but this time by the National Institute of Health, in fact, the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute. And it was tasked with developing clinical practice guidelines for the treatment of quote unquote overweight and obesity. That was the job. What's interesting is the chair and 3 other members of the panel, the National Institute of Health panel, the American panel, were also members of the International Obesity Task Force, all very incestuous. And they created some guidelines in 1998, which cited the WHO guidelines that hadn't yet been published but had been sent out, by this task force. And what's really important then is that they adopted the same cutoffs as the WHO, the same 25, 30, 40. But instead of talking about overweight, which is what the WHO did, they called it obesity. So the term obesity enters the chat in this moment. And so in 1997, or 19, I think it was published in 98, came into force in 99, I can't remember. But anyway, turn of the century, right? Minding your own business. You're just sitting there, minding your own business. And then one day you're told you're obese. Like it just happened. It didn't happen. You weren't, and then you were. And I know for a lot of people, like we think, oh, this has always happened. This has always existed. This term, this terminology has always existed. It didn't. It came into being. It entered the chat in 1999 or 98, 98 straight 99. That's really not that long ago, is it? Like I was at medical school. I can't believe that actually, when I think about it. I was at medical school. Now, prior to 2004, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services stated very clearly that obesity cannot be considered an illness. It is not an illness. That was in 2004. By 2013, the American Medical Association had decided, again, against expert advice, to classify obesity as a disease. So, let's go back and review, shall we? 1972, BMI. Best of the bunch, not meant for individual assessment. 1985, we changed our mind, we're going to use it for individual assessment. 1995, we're not just going to use it for individual assessment, but we're now going to have some cutoffs for what we call quote unquote overweight. 1998, 99, no, not overweight, obese. 2004, still, well, okay, fine, you can call it what you want, but it's not a medical condition. 2013, yes, it is a medical condition. You know what we still haven't answered? Says who? Where's your evidence? I get the steps that are I follow the history, but no one has actually told me why why you concerned yourself with a healthy weight for height in the first place. Like somebody somewhere decided that there was a healthy weight for height. They decided, but I want to know who they were and what evidence that they have. Because it traces back a really long time ago. It's not based on actual science or fact. It's based on theory and and religion and morality and eugenics and eugenicist theories. Because Quetelet was working at a time where it was all eugenics and and criminology and all sorts of like terrible things that we no longer consider to be okay. Lewis Dublin was talking about how to decide a healthy weight for height for an insurance company to make money. Nobody has given me any evidence so far that will persuade me that this is a problem in the first place, that we needed a BMI, and then that we needed to convene a panel by the WHO, and then that we needed to create a task force, and that we needed to have cutoffs. Nobody has convinced me, and even in 1995, the WHO said, well, there's nothing, we don't have any evidence. And yet here we are, 2013, the American Medical Association says, yes, it's a disease. They created a disease based on an arbitrary statistical cutoff, not on any underlying pathology. At no point in time has anyone actually been able to define what obesity is beyond a BMI of over 30. People have had a go, like they come up with some theories, but no one's actually been able to define it properly. No one, I went to medical school, I studied pathology, I looked at these damn microscope slides and they were really boring, by the way. No one has been able to be like, look at this under the microscope. Look at this blood test over here. Look at this. This is how we define. No, it's just BMI. We are treating an abstract statistical category as if it represents a concrete medical condition. That is a logical fallacy. When you conflate a statistical measurement with a diagnostic tool, that is a logical fallacy. And guess what? We've now come to realize, we've gone full circle, BMI is a load of shit, right? We know this. In 2020, there was a meta-analysis of 32 studies that just wanted to assess how well BMI identifies what people now call obesity, but basically unhealthy fat, unhealthy weight, or whatever you want to call it, obesity, whatever you want to call it. So we've come full circle, right? Ansel Keys was like, BMI works, and now we have a meta-analysis that has looked at 32 studies assessing how well it works. And what they did was they looked at BMI and then they looked at imaging techniques, actual imaging of people's fat mass. And then they found out that BMI fails to identify approximately half of people who have what they call excessive body fat on imaging. However, once again, their definition of excessive body fat is not based on anything other than, guesswork. Just somebody decided that's too much, that's enough, that's okay, that's not. Does anyone else understand how illogical all of this is? Am I the only one that's getting a little bit frustrated? So basically, we have discovered now the BMI fails 50% of the time at doing the one thing it was tasked to do, which was to measure, remember back to that 1972 study, was to measure healthy weight to height, relative to height. It fails 50% of the time. So it is not fit for purpose. But beyond that, it's based on the assumption that more body fat equals this now condition that is a medical condition that is obesity as a disease without proving anything. I do know this though, BMI poorly predicts our cardiometabolic health risk. So it is not good at predicting people's health outcomes, whether people will have a heart attack or a stroke or this, that, the other, right? It does not good at predicting. But the whole thing's a farce. It's a joke. It really is. We've never actually been able to prove that being fat is bad for your health. We're able to demonstrate an association, but as you all know, correlation is not the same as causation, assuming that one thing causes the other just because both are, seen in higher levels. It's not logic, it's not correct. The example that people often give, and I often give, is ice cream sales and drowning, or ice cream sales and shark attacks, whichever one you want to do. Did you know that when there are more ice cream sales, there are also more shark attacks? Facts. Ice cream doesn't cause shark attacks, it doesn't cause drowning. In the summer months, more ice cream is sold and more people go into the water and therefore are more likely to A, drown or be attacked by a shark. That's all it is. It's just correlation. One does not cause the other. And what is really problematic is because it's been over 100 years now where we've been telling people that being fat is bad, that there is something wrong with you, and we have been punishing people for being fat. In fact, it's more than 100 years, it's 200 years. The punishment that we receive for being fat could be the reason why fat people have higher risk of, or higher rates of, well, you name it, right? High blood pressure, heart disease, whatever, pick one, diabetes, you name it. It could just be because it's been long enough now that these correlations that we see could simply be attributed to the fact that fat people are treated poorly in society. It's like saying, oh, there are studies that show that you're more likely to end up in prison if black boys are more likely to end up in prison than white boys. That has nothing to do with whether or not black boys are more criminal in their nature. I mean, I know there are racists out there that suggest that they were. Those racists have existed for over 200 years, but there isn't actually any evidence to support that. But the society that we live in, the way that young black men, and this is predominantly in America, are treated, and then there's the whole issues with incarceration and how incarceration actually, some argue, is just another way of continuing slavery. Blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to get into it. I'm not an expert in these things. But what I'm saying is that, these sometimes it is the very thing, the very violence and harm and, yeah, unfairness and oppression that is perpetrated upon individuals is the very reason that they end up in prison or in hospital, and then we blame them and we say, well, it's your fault. It's not your fault, it's the way society treated you, right? So I think it would be fair to argue that it could just be that society has been treating fat people really badly. Weight stigma could absolutely account for, increased rates of cardiovascular disease among fat people, diabetes amongst fat people. But there could also be all sorts of other reasons. Like, for example, diabetes, classic example, insulin resistance causes weight gain. Insulin resistance causes diabetes. Ergo, people with people who are insulin resistant gain weight and then develop diabetes. And but the doctors, the experts say, well, it's your fault because you gained weight. No, it's not. It's because you've got insulin resistance, which is why you gained weight, and then you got diabetes. I mean, logic, right? Um, when but the argument is that weight loss benefits people because being fat is unhealthy. But when you ask people, like, what proof do you have that being fat is unhealthy? They don't. All they have is just a bunch of associations. So when you say you should lose weight because it's unhealthy, well, how do you know that? Well, being fat is unhealthy. That is a circular argument, what we call a circular argument. It's just going round and round and round and round without actually introducing any evidence. There is no evidence that being fat causes any health condition. There is no evidence that there is a quote unquote healthy weight for height. No evidence. There is no evidence that losing weight improves health outcomes. So my question is, why are we still working off these logical fallacies? Like, I get that they happened in the 20th century, turn of the 20th century, at the time it was okay for a public health professional to work for an insurance company and get away with it. Not so much anymore, right? I mean, they still do, but on the down low, they're not allowed to do it and get in trouble if they're too public about it. But the point I'm trying to make is that mistakes were made. That's fine. I'm not even upset about the fact that mistakes were made, but it's 2025. I've just told you the history. You can, there are, well, that is the history. Like, it's fact. It's on record as being fact. So, like, what is going on here, folks? Why are we not even addressing the core issue, which is that no one has ever been able to demonstrate that there is a healthy amount of weight for height? Ever. And if that's the case, what happens if we just accept that there isn't a healthy weight for height? And that, well, it's possible to be healthy at every size. Now, I use the word health, and for those of you who are thinking like health is a very stigmatizing word, that's very true. Go back to the beginning of this series of the podcast. I've talked about that in great detail. We don't owe anyone our health. Health is not a moral virtue, etc., etc., etc. The point of today's podcast was simply to prove that there's no such thing as a healthy weight, and that losing weight, therefore, won't prevent health problems, because literally the only argument anyone has ever made is you should lose weight to improve your health. Why? Because being fat is unhealthy. That's the argument. Decades of medical research, millions, probably billions, definitely millions, spent on said research, and that's the best we've come up with. So I hope you enjoyed that. I don't know if it made sense, but I'm not re-recording it, so I'll put it out there. Next time we have Taylor's story. What was that? What did I name them? Next week is Taylor's story. Don't forget that I have a toolkits up on the website, on the No Way Movement website, for people who are looking for support with their doctor's appointments. I mentioned it in last week's episode, and I'm sure I'll mention it in the newsletters as well. I am always available to hear from you, talk to you. I love it when people message me and say, oh, I have a question about the podcast. So feel free to do so. And I'll be back next week. Thanks very much, folks.